In this video, we will understand how to develop Spring Data JPA application to communicate with Oracle database. Alright, my name is Ashok. Welcome to our channel Ashok IT. Let's get started. First step, create Spring Boot standalone application with below dependencies. One is Boot Starter that will come by default. Second one, Boot Starter Data JPA to perform DB operations. Third one, database driver. I'm using Oracle database, so I will use Oracle driver. If you are using MySQL, you can configure MySQL driver. And project Lombok, which is used to generate setters and getters for our entity class. If you are not using Lombok, you can write setters getters manually. Once the project got created successfully, we need to configure data source properties in application.properties file. Data source properties means database URL, username, password, and driver class. Then third step, create entity class. Entity class is used to map with the database table. The Java class which is mapped with database table is called entity class. As we are going to use ORM benefits, we need to map our Java class with the table. That is called object relational mapping. We will use some annotations to map our Java class with the database table. Then create our repository interface by extending from data JPA repository. JPA provided CRUD repository and JPA repository to simplify CRUD operations. We can extend the properties from any one of those repositories. Now let's start. I'm using Oracle database, so to connect with the Oracle database, I'm using SQL Developer as a client software. Using this SQL Developer, I connected with my database, and let me create a table in the database. I'm creating a table contacts master. This table is having contact ID, data type is number, contact name, data type is varchar, contact number, that is also a number type, and I'm representing contact ID as a primary key in the table. My table got created successfully. Now go to Spring Tool Suite IDE to create our boot application with Data JPA. I'm creating Spring Starter project. Give some name for the project. Click on next and select here dependencies. As we discussed, JPA dependency required, Oracle driver, and Lombok dependencies. Yes, Spring Data JPA dependency selected. You can search for that. Oracle driver dependency selected. Project Lombok dependency selected. Click on next and click on finish. Our project got created successfully. Let us configure data source properties in application.properties file. Configure data source URL. Configure data source driver class. Let us create new Java class. That class we are going to use as entity class. I'm creating this in a separate package called entities, contact master entity. I'm writing variables in this entity class. These variables will be mapped with database table column names. To represent setters and getters for these variables, we are using @data. It is a Lombok annotation. If you don't know about Lombok, you can write the setters getters manually. This is our Java class and this is our database table. Now we need to map our Java class with the database table. Class name will be mapped with the table name and variable names will be mapped with the column names. To map class name with the table name, we will use @table annotation. To map variables with the column names, we will use @column annotation. Like this, you can map all the class variables with the columns in the table. Here writing @table, @column annotations are optional, because if you don't write table and column, class name will be considered as a table name, variable name will be considered as column name. If your class name, table name, if your variable name and column names are different, then you can map them using table and column annotations. To represent this Java class as an entity, it's mandatory that we need to write @entity annotation. @entity is a class level annotation. It makes our Java class as an entity class. And to map our variable with primary key column in the table, we will use @id annotation. It is variable level annotation. We are using contact ID as a primary key. So contact ID variable mapping to primary key column using @id. Now let us make changes to this Java class to make it as an entity class. @entity, which is used to represent our class as entity. Table annotation to map our Java class with the database table. Table name is contacts underscore master. ID to represent this as a primary key column. Column to map this variable with a particular column name in the table. Same thing, I'm mapping all the variables with the columns in the table using column annotation. Now let's create repository interface by extending the properties from JPA repository. I'm taking this as contact master repo, keeping in a separate package called repositories. To represent this as a repository, we need to extend the properties from JPA repository. I'm extending from the CRUD repository. We need to specify this repository should communicate with which table. For that we will map entity class name here and what is the primary key of that entity. Data type of the primary key will specify as ID. T represents type of the class. So this repository should communicate with the table using contacts master entity, and that context master entity primary key mapped variable data type. You can specify serializable or you can specify integer. Our primary key is a number type. This is our interface which is extending from CRUD repository. Using this we can perform operations with our database table. Now let's go to our Spring Boot start class. In the start class we are calling the run method. Run method will return configurable application context object as a return type. Using that we can get our bean objects. I'm storing run method return type into context variable. Using this context we can get our bean objects. I'm getting contacts master repository bean object by using context.getBean of master repository.class. Here repository is an interface, then how can we get the object? That's the magic here. Data JPA will provide implementation for our repository interface in the runtime by using proxy. The proxy bean object we are going to get here. Using that proxy bean object we can perform our operations. Now I'm setting the data to entity object to insert a record. Created entity object, setting the data by using setter methods, contact ID, contact name and contact number. With this our entity object is ready with the data. Now we need to insert this record using our repository interface. As our repository interface extending properties from CRUD repository, we can access the methods available in the CRUD repository. There is a predefined method called save method which is used to insert the record. Bean.save of entity. Bean is representing our repository object. By using that we are calling save method. Save method is a predefined method provided by CRUD repository which will take entity object as a parameter and it will insert the record into database table based on the data available in the entity object. Before going to execute our application, let's verify the table. Select start from table name. Let's see what is the data that is available in the table. If you see, our table does not have any data as of now. Table is empty. Now run our application which is calling repository.save method to insert a record. Run as boot application. Application executed and terminated. Go to table and execute the query. Now we can see our record got inserted.